Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines justice in reference to that which is just. So we have to look at what just means. And there are 5 basic components to it. Just, having a basis in or conforming to fact or reason. Conforming to a standard of correctness. Faithful to an original. Acting or being in conformity with what is morally upright or good. And being what is merited or deserved. Does anyone see a common thread through these definitions? All of these require an appeal to a standard. Each definition requires a firm standard against which something is measured, having a basis in or conforming to fact or reason, the standard of fact or reason, conforming to a standard of correctness, that which is correct, faithful to an original, acting or being in conformity with what is morally upright or good, and being what is merited or deserved. So justice is comparing something, some event, some idea, some action, against a firm, immovable standard and seeing how that measures up. This means 2 things. First, that standard exists. And second, if we lose that standard, we lose the ability to have justice. If there is not some standard by which we measure actions or events or ideas, there is no such thing as justice. C.S. Lewis perhaps said it best in his book, Mere Christianity, in a quote that has become central to me throughout this process. And he said this: "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust?" Now, Lewis then devotes the remainder of his book for evidences why he believes the Judeo-Christian God is the true God who defines what is straight, allowing us to recognize what is crooked. For those of you that wish to explore that dynamic, I highly commend that book to you. But for now, I want to expand on the conclusions that come from this, that are particularly relevant to our discussion. And the first is this: because the straight line exists, there is goodness. There is righteousness. There is truth. There is what is right. There is a standard that someone who has ultimate authority has set. The standard of what is good and right, and that straight line is not a matter of mere human opinion. Now, there are certainly many things in life that are matters of mere opinion. But if something is going to be truly evil, truly unjust, that requires a standard beyond human perception, beyond human opinion. If everything in life is based on nothing more than human opinion, there is no real standard by which we can deem something truly unjust or truly wrong. Even standards that attempt to appeal to universal ideas, for example, the idea that wrong is whatever harms the collective good, are still appealing to some sort of moral standard. Who defines harm? Who defines collective good? How much collective good do we have to have? Who set up the standard that harm is whatever hurts the collective good? There is always an appeal to some sort of standard. And without this, there is no such thing as justice. But if there is a moral lawgiver who has set a standard by which we can measure whether something is just, this means that goodness does exist, and so does evil. And there are some very healing truths that flow from this realization. The first is, if there is goodness, there is hope. We can see and we can feel the damage and the pain and the evil because there is good. We can see the darkness because there is light. We do not have to be consumed by a world that is filled with just darkness, because there is not just darkness. There is hope and there is goodness. This also means I can speak the truth about what happened to me without minimizing, without ignoring, and without downplaying. I do not have to pretend it is as bad as it was. I am not dependent on society's response. I am not dependent on what 12 people on a jury say. I can name and acknowledge the evil because evil does exist. It is not dependent on human perception, and goodness and righteousness can be found. This also means I can grieve the damage, even if others minimize it or excuse it. Being able to speak the truth and grieve the damage in ways that are non-destructive is really the first step to healing. It is really the ultimate definition of healing. Healing does not mean that you become the way you were before you were wounded, because the scars are there, and there are times that those scars are going to hurt. But healing means that you know what to do when that pain comes. And knowing that the straight line exists allows me to grieve that damage and to not have to minimize it or downplay it or ignore it. So again, to recap, the first thing we see when we properly define justice is that it requires a standard of right and wrong. Goodness and evil exist. We can discuss this and speak the truth about what was done without minimizing and without being dependent on society's response for validation and for healing. The second implication that flows from this is this: the moral lawgiver who defines goodness cares about justice and evil. In the Christian faith, right and wrong flow not from some capricious decision that God makes, but from the very goodness and holiness found in the character of God. The reason we feel evil and injustice so keenly is because it is such an aberration from that good standard. The God who defines the straight line cares about that straight line. And because goodness and evil exist in opposites, in contrast to each other, the more one understands good, the better they are able to understand evil. This means that God, as the ultimate standard of what is good, recognizes the evil even more fully than I do. The injustice of abuse is even more clear to God than it is to me, and he cares and it matters.